Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner. We're going to continue in this series on women of the African diaspora. And we've done part 1, we've done part 2 in regards to this particular topic. In part 3 today, we're going to look at sheroes of the American black press. Sheroes of the American black press. Well, where are we going with a topic like this? Women of the African diaspora, obviously we're talking about women of color. Sheroes, which is the kind of coined term for heroes. So these are the feminine aspect from the African diaspora that made an impact in American or through American black press. Well, before we get into this, let's talk about why this, in terms of writing and in terms of publication and press and journalism, why that's important. Well, let's use the authority of Scripture to kind of give us some sort of idea as to the value of the pen, as to the significance and the kind of things that the pen can do that maybe other things can't. Coming from the book of Job, chapter 19, verses 23 through 24, it says there, "Oh, that my words were written down. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that when an iron pen and with lead they were engraved." Obviously, in the book of Job there, the writer of this particular book is talking about the value of writing down words and inscribing them in a book. So it just shows that there is a value to publishing ideas and thoughts. There's a value to being a good journalist, to reporting facts and not reporting fiction. And he said, "Oh, that with an iron pen and with lead they were engraved." But when we jump over to Psalm 45 and 1, we find even more so that we find there's another passage that really talks about the value of the pen. And it says there, "My heart overflows with a goodly theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready writer." So he described his tongue as like the pen of a ready writer. But let's talk about the pen of a ready writer. This is a person that's always ready to take notice, to observe, to record what they observe, and through good journalism and through the integrity of journalism, reporting the facts is a way of getting the narrative out there and getting people to see from your lens what you've observed. The other thing we learned there, that if someone doesn't write down what they see, we don't know but only what we're told. By recording, by observing and putting it into some form of publication, we wind up having an idea or things we didn't see that have been going on all along. In other words, if a certain amount of injustice is always occurring and no one ever points the finger to it, sometimes people that are dealt with in an unjust way will resort to the fact this is the way it's always been. And people that commit these kind of atrocities, this is the way we've always done it. When we begin to report about injustice and those kinds of things just like that, we're opening the eyes of the public to get them to see something that may be behavior that's always been there, but no one really talked about it. No one really had the courage to express it. And so we're going to see some of that courage today in what we're talking about. Well, before we get to these important women in the American black press, let's look at another common term that we've heard many times. The pen is mightier than the sword. Now, this quote was coined by Edward Bulwer Lytton for his play in Richelieu. Although there are others who preceded him had their own take on the value of the pen. For example, Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621 includes, quote unquote, "From this it is clear how much more cruel the pen may be than the sword." Also, Thomas Jefferson sent a letter to Thomas Paine in 1796 in which he wrote, quote unquote, "Go on doing with your pen what in other times was done with a sword." The concept behind this quote implies that the might of writing is more powerful than fighting. That is, the power of writing can change the minds of people. And that's exactly what these sheroes from the African American, or should I say from the American black press, did. Let's look at the first person we want to talk about today, and that is Mary Ann Shad Kerry. She was a radical abolitionist reporter. Mary Ann Shad Kerry was born on October the 9th, 1823 in Wilmington, Delaware. She attended a Quaker school in Pennsylvania and was the eldest of 3 children. Her father worked for a newspaper run by a famous abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison, and that newspaper was called The Liberator. Shad Kerry's father was a radical, and she followed right in his footsteps. You know, that's kind of ironic that the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. You know, her dad ran a newspaper, and our father worked for a newspaper run by an abolitionist, and look at her. There she finds herself following in the footsteps for, she was following in the footsteps of her father. And so this is what she did. She was a radical. He was a radical. We need to set examples that our children can follow to carry the legacy on. And what better way to carry on the legacy? What better way to keep the narrative fresh in the minds of people is through the power of the pen. The fugitive slave law, which stated that previously enslaved peoples were to be returned to their former owners, even if they were in a free state. This caused an outrage. This led Shad Kerry to move to Canada with one of her brothers, and soon after, the rest of her family followed, in hopes to save other black people from this fate. That is what? If you were enslaved, to be returned to your former slave owners. To be returned to your former slave owners. Shad Kerry wrote a report in 1852 to let others know of the freedom that lay in Canada. Well, what if she didn't report this? What if she didn't make this known? Neither would her family and neither would others know, of a way out, of a way forward, of a way by which they don't have to return to their slave masters and their slave owners, as it were, but they can be free if they move to Canada. And we find this to be true. A lot of people did move to Canada. There's a lot of people of African descent on the other side of the Canadian border, and it's because of this particular impetus and this particular movement that happened during the abolitionist period. Well, let me tell you some more about Mary Ann Shad Kerry. Inspired by her father, Shad Kerry decided to start her own newspaper. Sometimes, we might start out as an apprentice and doing one thing, and we come to this great idea or an entrepreneurial idea. You say, look, why don't I do the same thing that I have been doing? And thereby you can kind of control, not only do you're able to garner the level of revenue that you need, but you're able to control and able to disseminate exactly what you want the public to know and not be shunned or not get some sort of pushback from telling the truth, from reporting facts. She titled this newspaper The Provincial Freeman and wrote most of the articles herself. Her newspaper was mostly directed toward black communities and was being distributed once a week. Shad Kerry devoted her life to anti-slavery, temperance, and general literature. Along with the newspaper, Shad Kerry decided to open up a Canadian school focused on diversity and inclusion. Now she's gone from not just from being an apprentice at a newspaper to starting her own newspaper. Now it's evolved in something even more powerful, and that is to create a school that was focused on diversity and inclusion. She was dedicated to new ideas and to what? Changing the status quo. There's a lot we can learn from this woman from the African diaspora. She was dedicated to new ideas. Some of us need to not be afraid of new ideas. She was not afraid of changing, but you can't change the status quo until you challenge it. In 1863, shortly after the Civil War broke out, Shad Kerry returned to the United States. She worked as a recruiting officer in Indiana and heavily encouraged black people to get involved in the fight against Confederacy and slavery. After the war, Shad Kerry became the second African American woman to earn a degree from Howard University in Washington, D.C. As we sum up Mary Ann Shad Kerry, this is what we know. She died in 1893 in Washington, D.C., but her legacy lives on. She broke many barriers for black people, and most specifically, black women. She was bold and confident in her work and constantly strived to demoralize things or denormalize things she felt shouldn't have been normalized. Notice that. She was bold and confident in her work and constantly strived to denormalize things that she felt shouldn't have been normalized in the first place. Most importantly, whatever she did it fully. Or we can, as the biblical writer says, whatever you do, make sure you do it with all your heart. We're going to talk about the second person here in just a second. You may ask, why am I focusing upon women at this particular time? All of you watching know that the month of March is Women's History Month. And what better way to celebrate women's history than to highlight some aspects of those from those women of the African diaspora, particularly today, those who utilize the power of the pen, the power of the pen. Let's look at this next character here. And this is Lillian Parker Thomas Fox, a preeminent African American journalist with deep roots in Wisconsin. She's described as majestic and a luminous journalist. Lillian Parker Thomas Fox is one of many black women who were pioneers in the field of journalism during the 19th century. Publishing her sharp and poignant writing across the Midwest, Fox aspired to direct human thought forward. Look at that. Publishing her sharp and poignant writing across the Midwest, Fox aspired to direct human thought forward. Boy, we can learn something from that. Am I a difference maker? Am I attempting to direct human thought forward? Now, she was born in Chicago. Fox moved to Oshkosh, Wisconsin with her family soon after her birth in 1854. She was known to be an avid reader and a devoted student until her studies ended abruptly during her third year of high school when she became engaged and married. Nonetheless, Fox continued her intellectual pursuits. She wrote many articles for the Wisconsin's black press, one of which fiercely called out American hypocrisy after the repeal of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This is what she wrote. You pity England with lords and commons, Russia with its czars and subjects, and yet practically acknowledge that you have a people among you of American birth whom you consider by God created for your servants, your inferiors by nature than by condition. So she is really putting it right out there. And many of you know that the oppressor many times utilized religion and utilized the Bible to validate that slavery was okay, to keep people in their place. And when people who are oppressed challenge the oppressor, the initial thing that normally happens is they get pushed back, and sometimes they lose their life. And so in this case, she was calling out the American hypocrisy by pointing out what they had stated by this powerful quote of something that we can think about. That is, if God has created every person on this planet equal, he's no respecter of persons, but to consider that God created humankind to be inferior to another human, then that is not the example that the Bible clearly teaches, but is how people have used biblical passages to keep people in their place. Fox's activism was not confined only to print. She founded several women's groups in Indiana and could be found sharing stages with other black women activists at various national women conventions. On her way to one in particular in 1895, Fox refused to move to the quote-unquote colored section of the train, resulting in her being kicked off in the middle of the night. She sued the railroad company, but the results of the suit remain unknown to this day. This act, along with other black women, would set the stage for Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks, who took similar actions some 60 years later. And lastly, as we talk about Lillian Parker Thomas Fox, she went on to become the first black journalist at the white newspaper Indianapolis News in 1900, though by her byline was never published. Her works, however, were supported by others in a larger black journalism community. Black journalists across the country often cited and crediting Fox when writing their own articles. In 2014, nearly 100 years after her death, Fox was finally inducted into the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame. Though Fox's story has been largely lost to the whitewashed, male-centered history, her contributions to the struggle were pivotal. Lillian Parker Thomas Fox is one of the countless black women who used journalism to cause change. Her accomplishments are evidence of her transformative work, quote unquote, directing human thought forward and toward a liberated future. Well, I trust today that you see the value in what we've discussed, see the value of what's being portrayed about the power of the pen. We looked at a couple of passages that kind of highlight that there is some value in taking up a pen and recording facts, observing, and then making through your own integrity and not bias, be able to display the facts, tell the facts with the intent to transform minds. Display the facts through writing with the intent to transform minds. I think that's an integrous role that these women laid out for us. And it's a model that we can draw from these matriarchs. We can draw from their contribution and make their ideas, make their ideology, their approach a part of our life. Come with us back here next week as we deal with part 4 in this series on women of the African diaspora, particularly now while it's still Women's History Month. We'll talk to you then. God bless.